Hey everyone, welcome back to One Piece Paneling Dojo, the show where we break down the paneling, visual storytelling, good composition, and other visual elements of new One Piece chapters. I hope everybody's been having a good week. It's coming up to the end of summer where I am, so it's getting a little cooler, but it's still nice out. For those of you who I know a few of my friends watching this are down in the southern hemisphere, might be finally getting warmer for you guys. Hope that's going well. So we're here to talk about, what was the chapter number again? 1092, I think. Yeah, we're on 1092. Or was it 1093? Well, it'll be in the video title. I don't have it in front of me. But this was a pretty good chapter. I hope everyone enjoyed it. So let's just jump right in. I think that the first thing that sticks out to me about this chapter is that, as I talked about last video, we open up with the panel ellipsis because we're transitioning somewhere else. And even though this chapter is starting fresh, we don't have anything before this, many readers will still remember that we ended last chapter somewhere else, and Oda is just always going to let us know that we're going somewhere different from where we last remember being by having this transition, and it's just nice that we get that. And now, the second thing is that I love this big first panel because it sets the scene, and that's another thing that Oda always does, and a lot of other manga artists also do, but not everyone, and not everyone does it as consistently. And that's one of those things I think you should try and pay attention to when you read One Piece or other stories. Are they always letting us know where things are happening? Are they always setting the scene, telling us where in the world, where physically things are? And I think you'll find that One Piece does it just much more than many others do. Now, technically speaking, we have a bit of a zoom in going on here because this is a big wide shot, and then we go in close to Kuma, and that's a little bit of a stretch because we don't even really see Kuma in this shot or anything. But then we zoom in here, and then we zoom in even closer here, and having that kind of gradual zoom is just a nice way to give a sense of progression, give a sense of sort of growing tension, growing drama, growing focus, as we sort of realize there's more and more mysterious things going on inside of Kuma's head. Now, this panel is great because it really emphasizes Kuma, We essentially have this big, wide triangle composition where he's at the top, so the whole thing is kind of just directing us up towards him. Everybody's eye lines are looking towards him. We have all of these lines with the chains pointing up at him, even his abs. And technically his body... And technically his body is shaped like this. But we have this full composition like this that's sort of there to make it feel even more like he's kind of a mountain. He's way above everybody else here. We have this low angle to really emphasize his size. And then we zoom in from that, and I have to admit, I find a little bit confusing here because I don't know what this panel ellipsis is for. And then we transition back in again, and I don't really know if that's telling us that a bunch of time has passed or if it's just kind of giving us a sense of transition. I'm not sure about that one. We're going to acknowledge the misses, we're going to acknowledge that not everything is done perfectly. And when you're doing something where clarity is as important as it is here, having something that's just unclear is a bit of a shame. But what I do like about this zoom in and this close-up is that we're really emphasizing his big empty eyes, and we're really emphasizing how mindless and empty Kuma is supposedly right now. Because it's sort of mysterious. What is his motive here? What's really going on in his head? And now the great thing about this first panel of the second page is that it's the same shot that we just got here, which gives us this sense of what the difference is, because we see it sort of before and after, or before we have this perfectly flat ground, but now we have this big crater, this big impact, and even the composition, as we talked about a lot last chapter, is bending a little bit around it to emphasize the shape of this explosion with the sort of circular composition. Because we have that before and after and all these subtle differences, this attack feels much more powerful. And now what we move into here is the confrontation with Akainu, and the great thing about the composition with Akainu is the sort of left-right directionality of this, because consistently, Kuma is on the right and Akainu is on the left. And before we even fully establish that, we also have this sense of distance here, this sort of silhouette, so we have this little, oh, who is it? And then we move on and then it's, oh, it's Akainu, so we have that sort of question and answer going on. But even before we know who it is, Kuma's on the right, Akainu's on the left. And even if we look down at these bottom panels, we have the same thing. Close-up of Kuma on the right, close-up of Akainu on the left. It's staying very consistent about that, and it's not just about the positions within a panel, but on the page as a whole. Now, onto our next pages here. There's not really a lot to talk about on the right here, so I'm going to blur it out just because, you know, the less risk of copyright issues, the better. Although we do have a little consistency of Kuma on the right and Akainu on the left, and a little bit that violates that there, but that's not that important, because as we move into the action, again, Kuma on the right, Akainu on the left. Kuma on the right, Akainu on the left, and then Kuma's still on the right, but Akainu pulls in. Now, normally when we have someone on the right, the motion feels more natural if they're kind of moving to the left, as we talked about a lot last chapter. And you would think that, oh, this violates this because Akainu is moving to the right. But it works because Akainu is the opponent. So when someone is moving from left to right rather than right to left, it feels like it's against us. It's against the character we're rooting for. And then we get this great impact here because, again, circular composition. Circle of the impact, circle kind of being emphasized around it. Even the sort of roundness in the wound on Kuma's head. And that just gives it a great sense of impact, along with these lines kind of pushing in on it, showing that sort of precise damage. And there's also a little bit of a panel order thing going on, because we have speech bubble, swoosh sound effect, then Kuma, then the fist, because, you know, we're going from right to left, so these things happen in this order. We talked about that a little last video too. And what this gives us the sense of is that Kuma dodged before the attack was fully hitting. He was moving first. He was not the slow one here, but if you look closely, it did catch him. And the thing I like about how it catches him is just the consistent imagery going on, because this is the same thing that happened to Whitebeard back in Marineford. Part of his head was just destroyed in this same kind of shape by Akainu's attack. And having that kind of consistent imagery just makes it more readable, more memorable, and it sticks in the reader's head more. And, you know, similarly, there's still a consistent imagery of how exactly Akainu's magma is drawn, with these thick brushstrokes and these round patterns, this kind of smokiness. And that's not the only way you could choose to draw magma, but what's important is that Oda has a specific way that he draws magma that thus becomes sort of Akainu's motif. And now the cool thing here is that before we had Kuma on the right and Akainu on the left, as is still going on here, but now we have the reversal. Now we have Akainu is on the right and Kuma's on the left. And the reason that's important is because, as we see here, Kuma's running away. Kuma's running past him. Kuma is essentially sort of pulling a reversal on him. He's sort of sneaking around him. And the great thing about the sort of left and right duality we had going on is that we get that same sense as a reader, because even though we aren't even seeing sort of the physical environment around them in this panel, we just get the sense that he went past him because he's flipped what the composition was on its head. Now it's Kuma on the left and Akainu on the right. And before, they were facing each other, their eye lines are pointed towards each other, but now, even though Akainu is still looking at Kuma, Kuma is looking away because Kuma isn't concerned with him. And what I like is that that's also just the plot of what's going on in the fight, but that entire thing is also represented visually, and that's really cool. And now again, this time, because it's the character we're rooting for moving, now we have this right to left flow that enhances the sense of motion. And of course, the panel order going on here is cool. We go here, go here, we go here. And so we have this beat, and he pops away, as we know he can do with his powers. And again, great circular composition, even though it's tight, to convey the impact of that. Now, after we have that sort of Kuma and Akainu sequence, we jump back to Egghead. And again, panel ellipsis to tell us that we're transitioning somewhere else. And the other thing that's good about transitions and about using consistent imagery and setting the scene is that by now, we've had multiple chapters that use this same motif of palm trees and marine ships in this same composition, marine ships below looking forward towards palm trees. And this means even though we can't even see any of Egghead's sort of iconic visual things like we see down here, we still immediately understand where we are because this imagery is consistent. And that's one of those things that, again, can seem obvious, can seem meaningless, but it's only obvious because it's done so consistently. Like, yeah, of course you should show the location that we're going to, and of course that location should be distinctive, but how many manga artists aren't actually doing that? Oda is always doing it. And now as we read through this, we have some of the same stuff that was going on last chapter with the flashes of light directing our eyes. So we go down here, and then we sort of follow this creature up and end up here. And the thing I like about this panel here is that it's pure visual storytelling. It tells us how the fight is going. It tells us that, okay, the robots were sinking in the water because they've been defeated. And again, that might seem obvious, but the fact that it's purely visual is harder to pull off than you might think. It looks easy when you see it done, but in practice, so many people writing, they always need to have some explanation. And a perfect example of that explanation is right here. Here, we have Egghead Island imagery up here, and a bunch of Marines walking forward down here. We don't actually need this text. We already understand purely from the visuals what the situation is, and what the dynamic of the fight as a whole is, that these things were defeated, so now the Marines were able to land on the island. And it's not really an awful thing that we have this text. You know, some text is okay. You don't need to go all in on being a purely visual story. But it is worth appreciating when it does convey those story beats purely visually as it does here. And after that, we jump straight into the Luffy versus Kizaru fight. But before we even talk about that, we have to remember that even though there's no panel ellipsis here, it's still giving us a transition because it's focusing on the location that's happening in. It's putting the focus there, it's having all of these effect lines to give us the sense that we're zooming in on that, so it's telling us we are going to what's happening over there, and what's happening there is Luffy versus Kizaru. Now, in Luffy versus Kizaru, once again we are reaping the benefits of consistent imagery. Oda is always using these dark, hockey-infused arms that bend at weird angles to convey that Snake Man is being used, and thus we don't actually need to be shown that he decided to use Snake Man. We don't need to be told, oh, he's choosing to use his fast form to try and keep up with Kizaru. We can just see, oh, this is how Snake Man looks, it requires no more explanation, and we can put together ourselves that he's choosing the speedy form against the Light Man. And again, we have this great rhythm here. We have Kizaru here, he's sort of bent back like this to show he's the one taking hits. We have Luffy's arms, and then we have Luffy himself. So again, there's that rhythm. Although some of you might be noticing that Kizaru is on the right here and Luffy is on the left, which is sort of a reversal of what I was talking about before, that the one that we're rooting for is usually the one on the right. But of course, that isn't a hard rule. It doesn't always need to be that way. If Kizaru is being put on the right in this page, then it's probably for a reason, and we actually are going to see that reason on the next page. But for now, we also just have a nice flow that's directing us where to go, because we go down from the speech bubble, through him, and then all of the lines of Luffy's arms are directing us towards where we should go next. You know, this is a little bit of a stretch, but it's literally forming an arrow, although I highly doubt that that was intended. And now we have the quick zoom in, that's just showing us their two faces, because, you know, how the characters feel during a fight is just as important as what they're doing. And having these two panels gives us a sense of rhythm. It gives us a sense of a break between the punches. It's not just constant punches. We kind of go back and forth between punches and not punches, which makes the punches stand out a little more, in my opinion. And the great thing about this too is that they're both leaning forward, their eye lines are both pointed towards each other. And that just gives a sense that we're still in the fight. They're still in the middle of this tension and conflict. And now as we come down here, we have Luffy's arms directing us where we should be going. But at the same time, here, the punches were hitting. Here, the punches are not hitting. We have that space. Also, not just Luffy's arms, also the beams of light. You know, it's not that our eye has to follow one particular line, it's that every line here is telling us, go down here. Go down to where we start this panel and then read it. And again, we follow Luffy's arms then to the left. But this is also a cliffhanger page because Luffy's fists aren't hitting yet. And then we get to the reason that we are so consistent about which side each character is on. Because the way that cliffhanger resolves is with removing one of them. Our brain immediately understands that Kizaru dodged, that Kizaru isn't here anymore, because we established that imagery of Luffy on the left, Kizaru on the right so consistently. It's essentially fight choreography within the confines of a page rather than fight choreography within the confines of the environment. And the environment is important too, but ultimately, the page is what we're reading. And so by knowing that Kizaru is on the right, and then turning the page into this and seeing Luffy still on the left, his fist going here, but no more Kizaru, then we get that sense of speed, that sense that, oh wow, he's already gone, he's so fast. That is so common in manga fights because we love showing off extreme speed. We get that without even needing to draw him on the panel, although, you know, like Luffy, you come here, you're like, oh crap, he's gone, and then you realize, oh, he's up here. And as our eye is sort of going up here, then like Luffy, we're looking up. We're getting this sense of distance between them, that there's so much distance on this panel. And the great thing is, even with Kizaru being gone, we're still obeying that Luffy's on the left and Kizaru's on the right, because we have this line that's essentially the battle line going down the page, and Luffy is only drawn on the left side of it, while Kizaru is only drawn on the right. And anyway, after we sort of go through this page and end up here, we follow the light line down to Kizaru, as is always done. And the thing I really like about this page, well, two things. The first is that this page is a great example of how Oda is always using the foreground and the background. There's always depth to an image, depth not in the thematic sense, but in the literal three-dimensional sense. We always get this sense that something is in the foreground and something is in the background, and that just makes the page a little more immersive and a little bit more interesting to look at, because you don't really want your pages to feel flat. And the other thing I like about this is a little bit of a subtle thing, but Kizaru is dark and shadowed here, and all of the dark and shadowedness is weighted on the right of this panel, which makes the panel feel a little bit imbalanced, because there's all of this over here, but none of it is shaded in, it's so bright. And to me, maybe I'm crazy, but that makes me feel like this sense of balance should be corrected, and the way that should be corrected is the dark element should go over to the left and fill it out more fully. And so it's essentially through just the weight of darkness on the page, making me want to see Kizaru move to the left, which is what he's about to do. And I think that's a genius way to set up the movement that's about to happen, but maybe I'm crazy. And after we sort of go across here, go down here, and go down here, this panel, I don't have much to say about it, but the great thing about these panels is it's so horizontal, and everything going on in here is essentially conveying that it's a speed line. The line of Kizaru's movement, speed line. The line of Kizaru's movement in the next panel, speed line, but it's parallel with this, so it's on one hand, it's sort of a continuity, this panel turns into this panel, but on the other hand, these two panels are working together on the page. And on top of that, we have the panel border that's also contributing to that. On top of that, we have the line and the sound effects that's normally just used to give a sense that the sound is lasting longer, but that is also conveying that it's a speed line. And finally, it's the horizontalness of this speech bubble, and that is actually a little more standout than you might realize. And the reason for that has to do with localization. So, a very typical way that manga organize their speech bubbles is horizontally, and this is because Japanese is typically written horizontally in manga. I can't really draw any kanji or katakana or anything, so I'm not gonna try, but it goes in this direction. And that's fine, but the problem is, once you get localized, it's actually very hard to typeset most other languages into boxes like this, and you have to see words split in half with hyphens. And so, manga that become popular internationally tend to realize that they're better off doing round speech bubbles, and that way you can fit Japanese, but you can also fit English or any other similar language like that. And so Oda is almost always going to use panels that are shaped like that, and that's why it is standout that he chose to use a very horizontal one here, which is actually pretty strange for him, and that's why we can respect that there's a reason for this choice, that it's there because then everything in this area is acting as a speed line and telling us it's moving quickly to the left. And then we move into this panel, and what's going on here is partially that it's a tight, narrow panel to tell us that things are happening quickly, because space is time on a manga page. When you have a huge panel, it sort of lingers as a moment, and when we have a small one, we move past it quickly, and we get the sense that the thing that's happening in it happens quickly. And so we kind of go in here, we get this sense of leftward movement and also forward movement, and then again, tight panel of Luffy, so we see that he is reacting to it, he does see it coming, but he isn't able to get away in time because it's so little time. Like, imagine if this panel of Luffy was a wide one like this, and then the Kizaru kick panel was down here. It wouldn't convey the same thing at all, because we would have way too much space to sit with Luffy in that moment, and we would think, why didn't he just dodge? And so we read this Luffy panel, and our eye goes directly up with Kizaru's foot. It's incredible. We get that huge sense of impact. We have, as we talked about last chapter, the radial and circular composition to emphasize the impact. And then, well, there's sort of more than one way we can go, because we can go down here and end up at the robot and the Sunny, but we also end up here and then move along with the sound effects to here. There's more than one way, but they're all leading us to the right place. And the thing I like about the robot here is that even though it wasn't really established in this chapter, I think the end of the last chapter will stick to a lot of our heads. And what was going on in the end of the last chapter was Kizaru was on the right, approaching the robot, and Luffy was between them. And thus, we sort of subconsciously remember that, and that sticks in our head. So when we see, oh, Kizaru was here on the right and Luffy was kicked, and then the robot looking back to the left, even though it's its own panel, it's still directly looking at the thing that just happened. So we understand essentially the positions that are going on here. We understand that Luffy is flying toward the robot because we remember those positions. And then as we come down to these panels, we read these, again we have the close-ups, the flashbacks, because Kizaru is thinking about his memories. Then we go along here, or along here. And the great thing about this is that the break in the robot is essentially acting as Luffy's speed line, which is just a really clever way to use such an unconventional part of your composition to convey something. And the other thing I like about it is that, again, the order things are shown in the panel gives a sense of time. We're moving from right to left. So the fact that the robot is here and then we have Luffy gives us a sense that by the time we got here, the robot is already broken, Luffy has already passed it, which gives us a sense of speed. Well, if Luffy was drawn like here, breaking the robot, we might get a greater sense of impact, but we wouldn't get a sense that Luffy zooms right through super fast, and that sense of zooming is more important here because of how important speed is in a fight against Kizaru. Now, I'm going to skip past a few more interesting panels and interesting moments so that I can talk about the final page here. I don't want to cover everything, I don't want to run into too many copyright issues, but I did have to talk about this final page. I mean, you know why, you see how cool this page looks. But to start with, we have Kizaru and we're sort of emphasizing his height. Notice how most of the characters are shorter than him, everyone is kind of looking up at him, and he's in the middle of everyone, which is helping emphasize his speed, though in a very different way from the actual motion panels. His speed is emphasized here because how did he get in the middle of them if not by moving so fast that they couldn't react? If Kizaru was on the side here, then we might just get the sense that he walked up, but he could only have gotten in the middle of them by being incredibly fast. And now we go down here, we read these and all, we follow sort of the eye line here, and that's another example. I have alluded to this before, but it's cool how even when we're in separate shots, separate panels, the characters will still be looking at each other, because it's not just about the physical things within the story, it's about the physical layout on the page. But now as we come up here, we reach, well, there's more than one thing we can do. We can just go up here, and we immediately get carried along Luffy's arm, but we can also come up from here, and oh, we run into Usopp and Nami, and their eye lines are pointing us directly at Luffy and what's important. So either way we go, we're being focused up to here, and then along here. And this page is just a gorgeous example of how foreground and background are Oda's favorite things to play with. We have a sense of Luffy in the background, Fist in the foreground, and we see the whole way that he stretches forward through them. From the start of One Piece, one of Oda's favorite things to draw is Luffy's powers stretching between the foreground and background. He loves having the fist stretch into the foreground while Luffy is far away, or Luffy is close and we see the thing he hits being pushed back into the background. It always just looks so interesting and so fun. Another thing that's great about this is that this first panel established the big hole in the wall. It actually is a pretty big part of the panel, and you wouldn't think it's important, and you might think, oh, well, it's just there to show that the robot was broken open, but it's because we understand that this hole in the wall is here, that the setup then has the payoff of Luffy comes through the hole in the wall. And we talked about this a lot last video, but again, this works even if you skip these panels. Even if your brain looks here and then immediately rushes here, you're not going to have necessarily missed something here. You should go back and read them and appreciate everything, but you're not going to miss any of the physical continuity. But the hole in the wall being here is important to the physical continuity, and that's why it does come up here and you see it before you see this, because we need to understand that hole in the wall to understand how Luffy is reaching in. And finally, the direction our eye is moving in is the direction that Luffy's arm would have swung to grab Kizaru, and we have this sense that Luffy is coming in from behind. So the whole time... Oh man, there's something I forgot to talk about. So I meant to talk about earlier, back on this page, just that the reason that Kizaru is on the right isn't just for this moment where it's, oh crap, Kizaru, it's gone. It's also because he is the one in control, he is the one kind of defining this part of the fight. It's his big attack that sends Luffy flying away. And thus, that attack is more important to follow, moving left from right to left. And so Luffy, much like Kuma, well, not exactly like what Kuma did versus Akainu, but in a similar sense, Luffy has now reversed it on Kizaru. Now Luffy is the one who is coming in from right to left. Kizaru was even looking to the left. He wasn't looking at where Luffy's come from, so we get the sense that he's surprised. And Luffy is the one doing this because now Luffy is in control. Now Luffy is the one who's defining the fight, whose movement we should be following. So that's pretty much everything that I have to cover about this chapter. Again, I don't even have the number in front of me. I feel so silly for that, but it's in the video title. So I hope you subscribe and like if you want to see more of this. I plan on just covering every One Piece chapter, and, you know, comment anything that you thought was cool about the panels in this chapter that I might not have talked about. And finally, I am thinking of taking requests on past chapters to dig into the paneling on, because, you know, there's so many One Piece chapters out there with great visuals that we can analyze, and part of my problem is, when there's over 1,000 of them, you get a little bit of choice paralysis about which ones you should even pick. And so I am happy to take requests from any of you on what you might want to see me talk about, what chapters you think might deserve a little more appreciation or that you want to understand a little more. I am not really sure what my schedule will be on doing other not brand new chapters yet, but you know, I think that I'll figure it out, and I'm happy to start taking requests on that now. So thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and keep enjoying One Piece or whatever else you like.